Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture. We'll get started here. Okay, so today what we want to look at is the Barnum tradition in advertising. That's going to cover the period from about the 1830s until the 1870s or 80s. It's, I think, an important thing to start with this period, in part because it is arguably one of the earliest forms of modern advertising or mass advertising. So, in that sense, it's important to understanding 20th century advertising. But it's also important because, as we'll see, there are modern day aspects of advertising and promotional culture which are very much a kind of modern legacy or a legacy of this earlier Barnum tradition. All right. So we're going to explore this in about an hour and a half today. So, okay, now I want to start with this slide of Barnum and Trump. Now, the book for this course is by Paul Rutherford. It's called The Ad Man's Dilemma from Barnum to Trump. And in the book, he does make an argument of sorts to say that Trump really needs to be understood in light of this longer tradition within promotional culture and advertising, and in fact, linking it right back to Barnum himself. So you will find, as I do, and you may well find, that there are many similarities between Trump's persona, his style, his kind of political ethos, if you want to call it that, and the way Barnum worked and functioned. So I just want to raise a couple of these points here, right? In this course, we will be focusing primarily on historical advertising, but a lot of what we do is to try and link the present to the past, link particular aspects of modern day advertising to the historical origins of it, and to try and get a better sense of that. And today we'll see that when we look at some infomercials later on in light of the Barnum tradition. But also, we want to do that because, in fact, there are many similarities between the way Trump operates today and the way that Barnum does as well. So, if you were to look at this from the standpoint of promotional culture, Trump is a strong embodiment of that. That means that he foregrounds things like salesmanship. He links salesmanship to entertainment, and ultimately, I think even to a form of hucksterism, a term we'll talk about in this lecture as well. So both of these men valued those things greatly. Salesmanship that was a form of entertainment, and ultimately a kind of hucksterism that comes out of that. The second point to remember about both of them is spectacle and hype, and even the kind of over-the-top exaggerated sense of self. Trump, of course, embodies that. It would seem pretty obvious, I think, to most people. But Trump also really values the way he does politics as a form of spectacle, right? He loves those large rallies, and he's doing them now even in COVID times. He loves those large rallies, not just because they kind of stroke his ego, but they create a kind of spectacle with him at the center of it. And you will find as well, when you look at Barnum, that he was very much like that. He understood that spectacle was really important to enticing people in terms of bringing them in to whatever attraction or exhibit he was doing. But it was also a way to get people really excited about things and about the kinds of events that Barnum would be doing. So spectacle, hype, exaggeration. The other point to remember about these two is the triumph of deceit over truth, right? Lying becomes an accepted form of selling, or in the case of Trump, an accepted form in terms of his political operation. Trump, as you may know, would be called, I think, by most psychologists, a habitual liar. He routinely lies. He can give a speech and lie 30 or 40 times, which has been documented by various fact checkers and media organizations. So his supporters do not see those lies as disqualifying for Trump. His supporters would see those lies as a form of creative kind of playing with the truth. And they would see it as part of the entertainment spectacle that is Trump. And they might even see it as sort of lying that is meant to offend elites and other types of people in society. Barnum prized the artful lie. That's what he would have called it. He prized the ability to fool people in a way that had entertainment value, but it was also a way that people did not go away feeling that they'd been ripped off. They may have felt that they were fooled, but they did not feel betrayed because they felt that the experience of being tricked by Barnum, let's say, in terms of some of the exhibits that he would put on, was in fact a rewarding one. It was in fact entertaining in that sense. And then the other point to remember with these two that, again, originates with Barnum and is very much taken up by Trump is the emphasis on anti-elitism. That Trump prides himself on saying he's against all the power brokers. When he was campaigning for office in 2016, he said he was going to drain the swamp of Washington. He said he was going to get rid of all those business elites and political elites in there that were effectively ripping off the system. He was going to drain it, get them out, and bring Washington back to the people. Trump is also against forms of scientific and expert knowledge elites. I mean, if you look today at what happens with COVID, he's even speaking out against his own government scientists because he wants the COVID thing to just kind of go away, I guess. He's against those kind of elites. He's against other types of social elites. He's against international kind of bodies like the United Nations, against sort of globalist elites, people like George Soros, who's somebody who works with global foundations. So his power in part derives from the way that he says he's of the people and he's against powerful brokers that are out there. Barnum did the same. Barnum effectively came to realize that what he was doing, the kinds of exhibits he was doing, the kind of garish advertising he did to support them, offended people. They offended social elites. They offended some of the moral elites in society, some of the political elites as well. And that for Barnum was a good thing. That actually made his supporters more excited about him because he was upsetting people that they may not even like themselves in that sense. Okay, so the other term that comes up early on in the book and is important to discuss here is the idea of the huckster. And the term huckster is used to disparage advertising, not just in the 1800s, but even later on. So the earliest form of a huckster, at least the way it was used initially, would have involved somebody who was, say, selling goods, maybe on the street, maybe out of the back of a wagon or something like that. And they were seen as selling kind of poor quality goods or shoddy goods. And they were doing it in a kind of over-the-top way. They might have their stand set up or their wagon full of goods, but they were then not just leaving it there for people to come and ask about the price. They were actually sort of doing things like maybe having some music that would go with it, maybe sort of a lot of yelling and screaming, engaging with people. The sense that it wasn't just about selling pots and pans on a street corner. It was a sense that you had to create a lot of publicity, a lot of noise around that, and hype, and even a little mini spectacle in that sense. So that was the initial incarnation of a huckster. They believed that you sold effectively not by asking about price or targeting people's reason or logic, that you targeted people's emotions and their kind of sense of the imaginative possibilities that were out there. Now, the huckster was condemned for being deceitful, for not being honest with people, for maybe hiding the fact that the goods were poor quality, these sorts of things as well. But the concern then came up when hucksterism showed itself to be effective, and in some ways Barnum was effective in what he did, and he was branded with the name huckster as well. It raised questions about the sense of the moral character of a nation. If someone like a huckster could prove successful, what does that say about ordinary Americans or Canadians, right? And people say that about Trump, too. I mean, it's one thing to condemn Trump for all he is, if you're opposed to all that stuff. But you also have to ask the question, well, what does that say about a country in which 40 to 45% of people support someone like that? They support a kind of huckster figure like that. And those are very good questions to ask and to think about. Okay, so we want to do a little bit of the biographical overview of Phineas T. Barnum right now. He was born in 1810 in Connecticut, in Bethel, Connecticut. His father was relatively of modest means. In fact, he would arguably be called sort of penniless at points because he experienced bankruptcies throughout his life. He was not a very successful businessman. His grandfather, though, Barnum's grandfather, was more successful, and he was a bit of a prankster of sorts. You might even think a kind of mean-spirited prankster. So for one example of that, when Barnum was a little boy, his grandfather said, Phineas, I bought you this wonderful piece of land out there, and when you get older, I'm going to show it to you. When you become an adult, it's going to be yours. It's going to be a great thing for you. And Barnum was always excited about the prospect of seeing this land and thinking about what it would be. And then when he was about 12 or 13, his grandfather said, come on, I'm going to show you the land. So he took him through the woods and went on this long walk. And they came out to a kind of swampy area. And the grandfather looked at him and said, there it is. That's what I got you, and started laughing. So it was a joke. He basically played a kind of cruel joke on his grandson like that. You might think that's a really mean-spirited prank of sorts. I probably agree with that. But for Barnum, he lived the life of a hustler. When he was in his teens, would work in a store selling goods and was always trying to figure out what worked best in terms of salesmanship and the like. Even at one point, he started doing lotteries out of his store. He would sell lottery tickets with the prizes being particular items in the store that people could win. And he would always sort of say, first prize might be some wonderful tea set or some wonderful silver cutlery or something like that. But when these people would show up, the winners of these lotteries would show up with their winning ticket, he would then take them in the back and show them some kind of junky kind of goods and say, there you go, there's your prize. Needless to say, it did not always go over that well. So he became a newspaper editor at one point, and that failed. I mean, many of his business ventures actually did fail. So he was a self-made entrepreneur, one who experienced both bankruptcies in his early career, like Trump, and one who also experienced forms of great wealth later in his career. Sort of like Trump as well, I guess, in that sense. Okay, so probably the most important business skill that Barnum acquired, as he would say in his life, was the way that he developed a sense of keen and deep insight on people, insight on the public. What motivated people, why they bought what they did, how you could persuade people effectively. And one aspect of that insight was that he realized that people would accept being fooled as long as there was a sort of entertainment value associated with that. And I think that becomes a key insight that guides him for much of his later life. And you look at some of the exhibits, like we'll see later, the ability to play a joke on people, to fool them, but they're not going to be resentful of that as long as there was a sense of entertainment that went with that became kind of overwhelming and compelling in certain respects. So throughout Barnum's life, he received all these kind of descriptors. The great showman, the greatest showman on earth, for various things that he would do. Some have argued he was the founder of mass entertainment in the United States. He was often called the king of advertising. And that's because any show that he put on, any exhibit, he advertised extensively promoting that show. So that many people who may never have gone to the shows actually would have known about Barnum's shows by seeing so much of his advertising in newspapers or on posters on the street and that sort of thing. He's also very important because of the way that he promoted and embodied deception over truth-telling. And for Barnum, that did not mean you were being immoral. It did not mean that you were upsetting the grand order of things in society. He argued that you could be deceptive with people in a way that still meant they would accept you and that they would, come to your shows and that sort of thing. And we'll come back to that term later, deception, and also how it links to early advertising and the critique and the criticisms of early advertising as well. Okay, So I want to look now at a couple of these attractions, these exhibits that Barnum presented early on in his career. So in 1834, Barnum became aware of someone else's traveling touring exhibit. And this was an exhibit that a man had, and he claimed to have a woman, 161-year-old African American former nursemaid of George Washington. That means she would have been a nursemaid somewhere back in the 1720s or 30s. Now, this touring exhibit was the owner of it was sort of looking to sell, and so Barnum basically approached him and said, "Hey, I'll buy your show. I'll buy it." And they arranged a price of $1,000, and by Barnum doing that, effectively he was buying a slave, because Joyce Heth was still effectively a slave in that society. She was also mostly blind, toothless, and mostly paralyzed as well. So Barnum buys this exhibit, or Joyce Heth, and he then decides he's going to tour the show, and he's going to do it in a more effective manner, in a more profitable manner. So he starts in New York City. He does extensive advertising as he was starting to realize it was really important. And the show turns out to be successful there. And then they go on a traveling kind of road show. And they basically do this for about 2 years. And people would come to this show thinking that, well, the show was advertised as presenting a 161-year-old woman who was the former nursemaid of George Washington. And that's what people saw. But they mostly just saw, a fairly old woman who was blind and partially paralyzed and really could not interact that much with people. So this happens for a couple of years, and then Joyce Heth dies in 1836. And you might think, well, Barnum would go, well, I guess that's over now. I can't do this exhibit anymore. She's dead. But Barnum came to think, well, maybe there's one last thing I can do with this. And he decided, because when people came to a show, there were often people would come and they'd have sort of skepticism about this. Oh, she can't really be 160 years old, and I'm not sure I believe it, and she does look old, but is she really that old? So he decided maybe there's a way I can make money off of that skepticism of my own show. And he then says, I'm going to have an autopsy of Joyce Heth. It's going to be a public autopsy. And I'm going to see if people will pay to come to this public autopsy. And the mortician or the doctor doing the autopsy, can then sort of pronounce how old they think Joyce Heth is at this thing. And that's what he did. In turn, he found 1,500 people who were willing to pay to come to this public autopsy. And he set the show up, or he set the actual event up. Now, this, as you can imagine, was quite controversial in local newspapers. But again, Barnum thrives on the controversy, right? Even if it's negative controversy. So one of the newspaper critics said, of this public autopsy, a more indecent form of raising money than by the exhibition of an old woman, black or white, we can hardly imagine. And Barnum later in life would respond to that by saying, controversy served my purpose as a showman by keeping my name before the public. So it didn't matter whether it was bad news. I mean, it's the old maxim that all news is good news, even the bad news, right? It's getting your name out there, the promotion of yourself in that sense. Okay, so I want you to, we'll look at this other promotion, other exhibit that Barnum had. And what I'd like you to do is just to click on the link that's here in this slide. You can do that on the slides that are available in OWL. And you'll see there's a short video. It's about 2 or 3 minutes long. It's from Harvard University. And it basically just provides a bit of a encapsulated summary of this story. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of supplement right here. So Barnum in 1842 buys something called the Fiji Mermaid. Now, what was that? That was something, it was a kind of a creation, almost like a piece of taxidermy that had been done by a fisherman in Japan initially. And later this was brought to London, and there were some showings of it there. This was an item that had a kind of different animal parts in it. There was some kind of orangutan, baboon, maybe even some salmon. And it was sort of put together in a way to say this is a kind of primordial mermaid that had been found in the Pacific. And you can see it's sort of half fish, half animal of sorts. And look, lo and behold, this thing is real, and people can come and pay money to see this. So Barnum decides he thinks he can make money off this. So he buys this item, and he decides he's going to display it in what was called the American Museum, which was a museum that he created in New York in the 1840s. And he wanted to, though, concoct excitement for this, right? Not just sort of putting up some regular ads. But what he did was he created a story, invented a kind of fiction around this item. And he basically said, look, I have this Fiji mermaid. And the problem is there's this fellow from London who's this naturalist, a kind of doctor. He's here now in New York, and he's basically presenting legal barriers to me displaying this to people. He says he's got some prior ownership issue with it, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I'm going to do is this. I don't think I can display this now, but he then approached 3 different newspapers. And with each one, he said this: because I'm not able to display this now, I still want people to get a sense of what it looks like. So I'm going to give you, newspaper 1, the exclusive rights to publish this image, a kind of woodcut image of the Fiji mermaid that I have. And he did that with newspaper 1, promising them that only they would have this image. But of course, he did it with 3 newspapers. So a day or 2 later, all 3 newspapers published the same day their exclusive about this, with this image of this mermaid. And then shortly after, Barnum then announces, lo and behold, my legal problems presenting this on display have now been solved. I can now have the exhibition go on. And by doing that, he got all this free publicity from these newspapers, which were effectively publishing the image of the object on display for them for free. And it created more hype and excitement. And so the tickets went on sale, and he judged later that it tripled the value of ticket sales by doing that little sort of sleight of hand with the newspaper editors there. Okay, so that's that. Now I just want to have a break now, and then we'll come back for the rest. Okay.